certainly was the case in my mother's time, that you had the word obey in the marriage ceremony. You promised before God man to obey your husband. That word is in there. My mother insisted on that. In her generation, she was biblically oriented enough to feel that that needed to be said. Today, many object to that. Well, Paul has some less things to say to the men than he does to the women. I think if you add up the words, that means nothing. The words to the men are just as salient and just as telling. It's in the same way. So what's in the same way there? But there's no question that there is a hierarchy here, being submissive in the way that we're submissive to God. We have to obey what the policeman says. I get that. I like the sense of law and order, don't you? The idea of shaking your fist at the authorities publicly. I know that's free speech, but that is a dangerous thing when it's overplayed for me. Too much free speech, too much tweeting, too much wild language, as we know. So in the same way, as you rightly point out, in the same way as detailed for us in relation to God, us in relation to all the authorities, wives, you wives, submit to your own husbands. There is some element of submission there. How you work that exactly in every case, I think every marriage has to work that out, because people are different in personalities. Sometimes you get husbands who are in some ways less equipped to lead than their wives. That can happen. Or vice versa. So how you balance all that, I think, would be a challenge. And certainly women are not chattels in the Bible. There were women who were business ladies, you know that. Lydia. In fact, the women do rather well. The women are the ones supporting the ministry of Jesus. Where were the men? They're out fishing or something. So the women are certainly not just chattels. They're highly educated in the Bible, some of them, right? I get that. And today they have equal opportunity. That sounds right to me. Provided they can do the work of home, and the main work, of course, is the bringing up of the children. I've noticed that the women bear the children and the men don't. I've noticed that. That's a very important distinction. There are built-in distinctions which have to be reckoned with. We know that if the unbelieving mate leaves, then you have a right to divorce and then remarriage. That's the passage in 1 Corinthians 7. That's clear. That marriage is something which is indissoluble, except for Matthew 19, where adultery or fornication is committed, let's call it adultery, ongoing, unrepentant, without any chance of coming back, then you have a right to divorce. And if you have a right to divorce, you have a right to remarry. One of the mistakes that's out there we need to try to correct is that when you're divorced, you're not married. That should be clear. Jesus in Matthew 19, we'll mention this now, he wasn't asked about, can I have a separation for any reason? He was asked about, can we have a divorce? That's important. The meaning of words is so important. Not just can we get separated, because there are Church of God people who got that wrong, and they said, no, if you're married until life comes to an end. And there's no exception. And the divorce exception is not a divorce exception, it's a separation exception. That's just wrong. So, first point is that if you're divorced legally, and 1 Corinthians 7, that's to say your mate leaves and there's no chance, then I think you have a right to remarriage. It appears to me that's the best view of all that. And the other exception is in Matthew 19, if adultery is committed against that marriage. I get that. Well, I take it that that is part of the way things are. Your husband has a right to rule over you, and you're supposed to be submissive to your husband. That's part of what happened at the fall, isn't it? I don't think there's any mystery to that. And the childbearing is a reminder, as we keep saying, we're in a laboratory in which the whole of this scene is typical and pictures our spiritual life, doesn't it? Born again, all these things are. So the childbearing, the agony of childbearing, takes us back to the awful mistakes that were made. What else can I say? He has an authoritative position over his wife. But that had better be handled with extreme care, because if it becomes brutal, and Paul, let's go through this briefly. Paul clearly says if you have two believers who are married, there's no right to divorce. Forget that. We ran into a case of that, unfortunately, and had to deal with it. If you have two believers, I repeat this, two genuine believers, and they're married as Christians, then divorce is impossible. And he even says, if one of them were to leave, heaven forbid, they are not to marry someone else, but get reconciled. That's quite clear. They're to remain unmarried. And people say, well, that means they're free to remarry. No, expressly not. Somebody even dared to quote the Roman law as favouring, freedom to get out of a marriage, which Paul didn't allow for, among two believers. That's clear. So if one of them should leave, or, as you say, if somebody's being beaten, they've got to get out of there. At that point, I would say that the believer has become an unbeliever. If they were ever a believer, If they're beating their wife and using violence, that's the end of it. They're not anymore a believer. So if they leave, then I think the woman has complete freedom to marry again, because the believer has become an unbeliever, and that can happen. It's very clear. Now, people have twisted that text by saying she should remain single, that Paul is supposed to be saying if she's not married. That's not what he means. She should remain on her own and not get married to somebody else is the point there. Clearly, right? Remaining single doesn't mean she's divorced. The exact opposite point here. She's not divorced. She's not free to remarry. She's not to marry someone else. She's to either remain on her own or get reconciled to her husband. Certainly then you have no right to remarriage as long as you're both believers. That's out of the question. You have to seek counseling, whatever. You've got to get together. But let her remain on her own. That's not married to someone else. That's what that means. Either stay on her own until it's reconcilable, or get get straight with your husband or wife. That's very clear. Paul obviously says you should marry or remarry if you're free to remarry. You should marry in the faith. That's the ideal thing. In many cases that doesn't happen, and it ought to, but it doesn't happen, and then that leads to more problems. Hopefully then you can convert your prospective mate before you get married, or if not, as the case is here, by your very wonderful behavior, either the man or the woman, you win the other one. So that's exciting when that happens. Jesus was asked the direct question, as we know in Matthew 19, can we have a divorce for any reason? Because after all, Jesus, you know what Moses said? Well, actually, we don't fully know what Moses said. It isn't quite clear what that exception was. It doesn't matter, because whatever it was, it's gone. And so Jesus then takes them back to Genesis, and he says, Moses allowed you to have divorces for certain reasons, which are not entirely clear. Doesn't matter, because that's gone. People want to argue, well, what was that? Forget that. That's not for us now. Jesus then said, but I'm telling you, in advance of Moses, he's going beyond Moses, isn't he? Which is fascinating to me. He's discounting Moses, as later on Paul develops that theme a lot. So you have only one exception that Jesus gives, and then Paul adds a second one. You have two exceptions. One is where you have unrepented, continuing, unforgiven, breaking the sexual bond. That's quite clear. And secondly, where you have an unbelieving mate who just leaves. Then you are not, as one commentator says, you're not bound to chase that leaving or departing person around the Roman Empire to keep the marriage together. I get it. But apart from that, there is no excuse or reason for divorce. That's very clear. That's the standard evangelical view, by the way. We're not saying anything terribly wild. What is wrong is where you forbid second marriages on every account. That leads to fornication very often. And Paul did say it's better to be single in view of what he sees, the impending end of the age. I think we're not quite bound by that. I see the end of the age in some way, but not quite as urgently as Paul did. However that works. But you're to obey it by marrying in the faith. That's very clear. I think we covered the ground very well. Yeah, we're fellow heirs of the grace of life, which is given us now in part. But one thing I find in emails week by week, people are very bad at balancing the text. They're not thinking like Hebrews. People look out at those temple buildings, and Jesus says they're all going to fall down. And then you find him discussing a future temple building. That throws people. They can't deal with it. You've got to think like a Hebrew, which grasps a totality. Think about the episode in Isaiah 7, where, behold, a virgin will conceive and bear a child. That wasn't a literal virgin there. But Matthew comes along and says, it is now, in the case of Jesus. Can you handle that? Oh, he's contradicting Isaiah. Well, wait a minute. That's not right. You grasp a totality. That episode in the time of Isaiah and Ahaz was a virginal thing in some sense. She wasn't a virgin. Literally, a well-known young lady was going to bear a child. That's not the end of the story. There's a further and second fulfillment. Same with Matthew 24. The fall of the temple in 70 AD, as it turns out, was not the one that led to the end of the age. Can you grasp that? Jesus then says, you people in front of me killed Abel. They didn't. Can you handle that? It's a corporate thinking in groups, not picking everything apart all the time. Okay, Sarah obeyed Abraham. That's the strongest text, by the way. Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, calling him Adoni, as Messiah is called Adoni in Psalm 110:1, calling him Lord, my Lord. And you have become her children, figuratively speaking, obviously not literally, but figuratively speaking, if, that is, you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. So you're not to be scared of your mate, that's out of the question. Your husbands, the same way. Live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel. The word there is a vessel. We're looked at as containers, both men and women, and we're operating in different spheres, obviously. And she's the weaker one. Well, physically, that's certainly often true. Emotionally, it may be quite the opposite sometimes. The husband would be weaker emotionally than her wife, and his wife, her wife, sorry. I got the pronouns mixed up, which you hear now, which isn't a joke. To sum up then, I like that. Here's my point, verse 8. Let me read 8, or who's going to read 8 for us?
You.
Me, okay. To sum up, all of you would be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit. That's an interesting example of doctrine and Christian living to me. You know, people say, I just want to hear about Christian living. Don't give me any of this doctrine. That is flat out false. Peter does it all together. Jesus does too. So there's a whole lot of stuff about Jesus traveling around the universe, isn't there here? How does that affect Christian living? Massively, because the gospel is understanding what God is doing, coming into line with his great plan. So this is marvelous doctrine and Christian living, the whole thing, marvelous, inspired material for me. And it's, I can promise you, the cause of massive confusion in the commentaries.